When World War I began in August 1914, most people think of muddy trenches in France and Belgium. But the war spread far beyond Europe. It reached into the heart of Africa, where European empires had claimed colonies as their own. Germany controlled German East Africa, which is now Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal surrounded these German territories with their own colonies. When Europe went to war, they brought their fight to African soil. The African people, who had no part in starting this war, would pay the heaviest price. Over 1 million Africans would be forced to serve in this foreign conflict, and at least 100,000 would never return home. East Africa was nothing like the battlefields of Europe. There were no paved roads connecting cities. Railways existed in only a few places. The landscape was a mixture of thick jungle, massive swamps, towering mountains, and open savanna filled with dangerous wild animals. The climate was brutal: intense heat, heavy rains that turned paths into rivers of mud, and humidity that made everything rot. European soldiers called it the white man's grave because disease killed more men than bullets ever would. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes swarmed everywhere. Dysentery spread through camps like wildfire. The tsetse fly carried sleeping sickness, a disease that was almost always fatal. This wasn't a place where modern European armies could easily fight. The British and German armies arrived in East Africa with modern equipment they'd used successfully in Europe. They brought trucks, motorcycles, and wagons pulled by horses, oxen, and mules. Within weeks, almost all of it was useless. Horses died from trypanosomiasis, the sleeping sickness carried by tsetse flies. Most horses survived less than a week. Mules and oxen lasted slightly longer but still died by the hundreds. Trucks and vehicles broke down constantly. Engines overheated in the extreme temperatures, axles broke on the rough terrain, and tires rotted in the humidity. Spare parts were thousands of miles away in Europe. The modern armies found themselves stuck with supplies piling up at the coast and no way to move them to the soldiers fighting in the interior. Faced with the failure of their machinery and animals, the European commanders turned to the only technology that worked in Africa: human beings. They needed men who could carry heavy loads on their backs and heads through terrain where vehicles couldn't go. Men who knew the land, could survive in the climate, and wouldn't die from tsetse flies. So the British created the Carrier Corps, a massive labor force of African men who would carry every single thing the army needed on their backs. They didn't carry just food and water. They carried ammunition, artillery shells weighing 60 pounds each, medical supplies, tents, officers' personal belongings, even wounded soldiers on stretchers. Everything the army needed moved on African backs. The British called it recruitment, but it was really forced conscription, taking men whether they wanted to go or not. British officials went into villages across Kenya, Uganda, Nyasaland, now Malawi, northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and eventually German East Africa and the Belgian Congo. They demanded each village provide a certain number of men. Village chiefs had no choice but to comply. Refusing meant punishment or imprisonment. Some men volunteered, hoping for adventure or pay. But most were forced. British officers and African soldiers working for them would surround villages, select the strongest-looking men, and march them away at gunpoint. Families watched their fathers, sons, and brothers disappear, often never to return. When African men were pressed into the Carrier Corps, they weren't treated as individuals with names and families. They were given numbers. Each porter received a brass identification tag worn around the neck, stamped with a number. Porter 4327 or Carrier 10891. Their names weren't recorded. Their villages weren't documented. If they died, that number was all that identified them. They weren't issued proper uniforms. Most carriers wore only loincloths or whatever tattered clothes they'd been wearing when taken from their villages. Some received a simple shirt or shorts, but many had nothing. They marched barefoot through thorns, mud, and rocky terrain. The British saw them not as human beings but as machines, walking machines that didn't need fuel or spare parts, just a little food and water. The standard load for a carrier was 60 pounds, about 27 kilograms. That's roughly the weight of a 10-year-old child. Now imagine carrying that weight on your head or back for 15 to 20 miles every single day, through swamps, up mountains, across rivers in intense heat. The loads varied: wooden crates of ammunition, heavy brass artillery shells, sacks of rice or flour, water containers, medical supplies, machine gun parts, tents, officers' trunks full of personal items. Some carriers were assigned to carry the sick and wounded on stretchers, which meant two men carrying perhaps 200 pounds together. They walked in long lines, sometimes 500 or 1,000 men stretching for miles, each step an agony, each mile a test of endurance. The logistics of supplying an army in East Africa were nightmarish. To deliver just 1 ton of supplies to soldiers fighting in the interior required incredible numbers of carriers. Here's why. Carriers had to eat too. To carry supplies 450 miles from the railhead to the front lines took about a month of walking. Each carrier needed food for that month. So if you sent 100 carriers with supplies, you also had to send carriers carrying food for those 100 carriers. But those additional carriers also needed food, so you needed carriers to carry food for them. According to British calculations, to deliver 1 ton of supplies to the front required approximately 16,500 carriers total. Only 2,500 carried actual military supplies. The other 14,000 carried food for the carriers themselves. A typical day for a carrier began before dawn. They woke in whatever rough camp had been set up, often just sleeping on the ground with no shelter. Breakfast, if it came, was usually a small portion of maize porridge or cassava. Then came loading, each man given his 60-pound burden to carry. They marched from sunrise, taking occasional short breaks to rest and drink water if any was available. The lines stretched for miles. Guards, either British soldiers or African Askaris soldiers, walked alongside, ready to beat or shoot anyone who couldn't keep up. The heat was crushing. Sweat poured off their bodies. Feet blistered and bled. Shoulders and backs screamed in pain under the constant weight. They marched until evening, covering 15 to 20 miles, then collapsed wherever the line stopped. Carriers faced what soldiers called the Big Three, the 3 main causes of death in East Africa. First was dysentery, a terrible intestinal disease caused by contaminated water and food. It gave men uncontrollable diarrhea, dehydration, and extreme weakness. Men literally died from losing too much fluid from their bodies. Second was malaria, spread by mosquito bites. Malaria caused high fevers, chills, severe headaches, and organ failure. There was no cure. Third was simple exhaustion. Men pushed beyond human limits, underfed and overworked, simply collapsed and died. Their hearts gave out. Their bodies shut down. When a man fell, the line didn't stop. Guards checked if he was alive. If he was dead, they took his brass tag for records. If he was alive but couldn't walk, they usually left him by the trail. The line moved on. The death rate among carriers was staggering. In some units, 20 to 25% of carriers died. 1 in 4 men never went home. To put this in perspective, the Battle of Verdun in France was one of World War I's deadliest battles, where soldiers fought for 10 months in brutal trench warfare. The death rate among British carriers in East Africa was higher than the death rate at Verdun. Let that sink in. These men, who weren't even soldiers, who were just carrying supplies, died at a higher rate than trained troops fighting one of the war's bloodiest battles. By the end of the war, approximately 95,000 to 100,000 African carriers had died. Some historians believe the real number could be as high as 150,000 because record-keeping was so poor. It wasn't just the British who used African carriers. The Germans did too, and conditions were often even worse. German forces in East Africa, led by the brilliant commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, fought a guerrilla campaign for the entire war. They were constantly moving, constantly raiding, and they relied completely on African porters. The Germans kept almost no records of how many carriers they used or how many died. One German official later wrote that they could make no overall count of carrier deaths due to absence of detailed sickness records. Historians estimate the Germans may have used 350,000 carriers with death rates similar to or higher than the British. Many German carriers were basically slaves, taken forcibly and rarely paid. When carriers could no longer keep up, they were simply abandoned. Belgium and Portugal also used African carriers, and their treatment was among the worst. The Belgian Force Publique fighting from the Congo used approximately 260,000 carriers. Belgian troops were ordered to live off the land, which meant stealing food from African villages. This caused massive famines. Belgian records show only 5,000 military casualties, but exclude 15,650 porter deaths. Deaths they simply didn't count as important. The Portuguese forces in Mozambique used thousands of carriers, but kept no records at all. Historians estimate Portuguese operations killed thousands of African porters, but we'll never know exactly how many because Portugal never bothered to count. To the European powers, African lives simply didn't matter enough to record. The war's impact extended far beyond the carriers themselves. When colonial powers took so many men from villages, entire communities collapsed. There weren't enough men left to farm the fields. Crops failed. Food production plummeted. Then came requisitioning. Colonial armies simply took food, cattle, and supplies from villages to feed their troops, paying little or nothing. The combination of labor shortage and food theft led to widespread famine. In German East Africa alone, approximately 300,000 civilians died of starvation during the war years. The rain failed in 1917, making the famine even worse. Entire regions were depopulated, villages disappeared, families starved, and this was considered acceptable collateral damage in Europe's war. As if war and famine weren't enough, in 1918 the Spanish flu pandemic reached Africa. This deadly influenza strain killed millions worldwide. In Africa, it was catastrophic. The war had created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Thousands of carriers and soldiers were constantly moving along newly created roads and railways, carrying the virus to remote communities that would have been isolated before the war. Crowded military camps became infection hotspots. Malnutrition from famine meant people had weakened immune systems. In British East Africa alone, 160,000 to 200,000 people died of Spanish flu, 10% of the entire population. Across sub-Saharan Africa, 1.5 to 2 million people died. The war had set the stage for mass death from disease. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Carrier Corps story is how silent and invisible their suffering was. British soldiers fighting in Europe wrote letters home. Their families received telegrams if they died. They were buried in marked graves. Newspapers reported casualties. But carriers. A British Colonial Office bureaucrat later wrote that the East African campaign had not become a scandal only because the people who suffered most were the carriers. And after all, who cares about native carriers? That statement reveals the racism at the heart of colonialism. African lives simply didn't count. Their deaths weren't scandals. Their families weren't notified. They disappeared into the bush and were forgotten by the empires that used them. Behind every number was a real person with a family, dreams, and a life. Take Dolly Jenniker and Zulu Madliwa, two boatmen who worked for South African Railways in Durban. They were assigned to help transport supplies across the Orange River. On January 23, 1915, while ferrying supplies, their boat capsized in flood waters. Both men drowned. Dolly left behind a wife named Molly in Port Elizabeth. She received no pension, no compensation. Or consider the 129 men who died aboard the ship Aragon in 1917. They were sick carriers being sent home from East Africa. The ship was detained in harbor for 9 days, during which 74 men died of malaria. More died during the voyage. They never made it home. Each had a name, a family waiting, a story we'll never know. By 1917, even British officials were becoming concerned about the terrible conditions and death rates among carriers. The War Office ordered Surgeon General William Watson Pike to investigate medical conditions in the East African Campaign. His 1918 report, known as the Pike Report, was damning. He found that 75% of forces, both soldiers and carriers, were lost to disease rather than combat. Medical facilities were grossly inadequate. By October 1917, there were only 13,000 hospital beds for carriers, most located far from the front lines where carriers actually worked. Men dying of malaria, dysentery, or pneumonia couldn't reach hospitals. They died on the trail. The Pike Report concluded that the medical failures were unacceptable, but by then, the war was almost over. By the time World War I ended in November 1918, the East African Campaign had consumed enormous resources for minimal strategic gain. The British spent vast amounts of money, hundreds of millions of pounds. They deployed 150,000 combat troops and used over 1 million African carriers. What did they gain? Control of German East Africa, which became a British mandate after the war. But Germany had already lost the war in Europe. The African Campaign didn't change the war's outcome. It was an expensive sideshow that mostly served to satisfy imperial ambitions. The real cost was paid by Africans. At least 100,000 carriers dead, 300,000 civilians starved, hundreds of thousands more killed by disease, and entire regions devastated. All for a war that wasn't theirs. German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck became a legend for his guerrilla campaign. He fought the entire war, from August 1914 to November 1918, never losing a battle or being captured. He tied down hundreds of thousands of Allied troops who could have fought on other fronts. Military historians still study his tactics, but his success came at terrible cost to Africans. His constant raiding and living off the land meant stealing from African villages. His troops requisitioned food, causing famine. He used thousands of African carriers, most impressed by force. After the war, Lettow-Vorbeck wrote a book about his campaigns. He barely mentioned the African carriers who made his success possible. To him, they were just background, tools he used to fight his brilliant campaign. After the war ended, victorious nations built monuments to their dead. In every British, French, and German town, war memorials listed local soldiers who died. Cemeteries in France and Belgium became sacred places with white crosses stretching to the horizon. But for African carriers, for decades, almost nothing. In Nairobi, a memorial was eventually built, but for many years it didn't list names, just a general dedication to the Carrier Corps. In Mombasa, another memorial was placed on Jomo Kenyatta Avenue. The 14,000 carriers from northern Rhodesia got a memorial in Mbala, Zambia. But these were exceptions. Most carriers who died were never commemorated. They lay in unmarked graves scattered across East Africa. Their families never knew exactly where or how they died. The Carrier Corps made the East African Campaign possible, yet history largely ignored them. Military histories focused on battles, tactics, and commanders. They mentioned logistics only briefly. The million-plus carriers who actually enabled the entire campaign were footnotes, if mentioned at all. British military reports praised the magnificent work of the Carrier Corps, but framed it as Africans serving the empire, not as Africans being exploited. Colonial propaganda after the war portrayed carriers as loyal servants who were proud to serve. The reality, forced conscription, terrible conditions, mass death, was buried in classified reports. It would be decades before historians began seriously examining what happened to African carriers and telling their true story. The truth was too ugly to acknowledge. The Carrier Corps experience had lasting effects on African societies. Entire villages lost their men. Women and children struggled to survive without husbands and fathers. Young men who survived came home traumatized, sick, and often unable to work. The mass conscription and famines weakened communities for years, but there was also a political impact. African men who served saw European colonizers as fallible and beatable, not the invincible masters they pretended to be. Armed African askaris had killed white soldiers. European troops had died from disease and hunger just like Africans. This knowledge planted seeds of resistance. Many future African independence leaders either served in World War I or were inspired by stories of it. The war showed Africans they could organize, resist, and eventually overcome colonial rule. Only in recent decades has the story of African carriers in World War I received proper attention. In 2014, during the war's centenary commemorations, historians published new research documenting carrier experiences. Museums created exhibitions. Documentaries were filmed. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission began a project to identify and commemorate African Labor Corps members who died but were never properly honored. In January 2025, a new memorial in Cape Town's Company Gardens was unveiled, commemorating 1,700 South African Labor Corps members with individual wooden posts bearing each man's name and death date. These efforts can't undo the injustice, but they ensure that future generations know what happened. The invisible army is finally being seen. The story of Africa's role in World War I is ultimately about humanity denied and then reclaimed. Over 1 million African men were forced to serve in a war they didn't start, for empires that didn't value their lives. At least 100,000 died carrying supplies on their backs through some of Earth's harshest terrain. Another 300,000 civilians starved because armies took their food and farmers. Millions more suffered from disease, displacement, and trauma. For decades, their sacrifice was forgotten, dismissed as unimportant, but history is being rewritten. We now recognize that Africa's contribution to World War I was massive, and that the cost Africans paid was catastrophic. The Carrier Corps weren't just background workers. They were essential to the entire campaign. They were human beings with names, families, and lives that mattered. Their story reminds us that war's real cost is always measured in human suffering, and that the most important casualties are often the ones history forgets to count.